The first vethrani soldier, Sergeant Nara Osai, pulled from the rubble, had no legs below the knees. She found him under a collapsed blast wall in what had been, 6 hours ago, a forward aid station on the northern ridge of Kethos Prime. The wall had fallen inward during the second orbital bombardment, and the vethrani, a broad-chested reptilian male with slate-green scales cracked and blackened from thermal flash, had been pinned under 2 metric tons of reinforced composite for the entire duration of the third. His amber eyes tracked her headlamp as she cleared the debris from his chest, but his mouth never opened. No scream, no plea. The thick crest of darker scales running from his brow to the back of his skull was rigid, locked upright in what Osai recognized from the briefing packet as a dominance posture. Even crushed, even burned, this soldier was refusing to show weakness to a species he had never seen before. "Easy," Osai said. She kept her voice flat, professional. The vethrani didn't speak standard, and the translation module clipped to her collar was still cycling through their linguistic database, but tone carried across biology. Calm hands, steady voice, the universal language of someone who was not going to let you die. She ran her palmed scanner down his torso. 3 fractured ribs, the left lung partially collapsed, severe burns across 40% of his upper body, and the legs gone. Clean severance. The blast wall had crushed them and the thermal pulse had cauterized the stumps. He wasn't bleeding to death. He was, against all reasonable biology, stable enough to save. "Vasquez," she called into her squad channel. "I've got one under the north wall. Alive. Double amputation below the knees, burns, lung compromise. I need a drag stretcher and 2 units of their plasma analog." Corporal Hector Vasquez's voice came back through static. "Copy. I'm 40 meters south, pulling 3 more out of a trench. Driscoll's coming to you with the stretcher. 2 minutes. 2 minutes. Osai pressed a coagulant patch against the worst of the burn margins on the vethrani's shoulder, and his eyes narrowed not in pain, but in confusion. His thick, clawed hand came up slowly, hesitated, and then touched the back of her gloved wrist. The touch was deliberate, controlled, like a man checking whether the thing in front of him was real. "I'm real," she said, "and you're going to be fine." The translation module beeped twice and rendered a string of guttural syllables. The vethrani's amber eyes widened. His crest lowered 1 degree. Behind Osai, the sky was still on fire. Kethos Prime had been a vethrani border garrison, one of 11 outposts that anchored their defensive line along the Sareth Reach, the narrow corridor of contested space between vethrani territory and the Caliph Dominion. The Caliph had spent 2 years building a fleet behind a sensor-blind nebula. 48 hours ago, they had used it. 11 outposts, simultaneous strikes, orbital bombardment followed by ground assault, targeting command infrastructure, communication arrays, and, with a precision that suggested deliberate cruelty, medical facilities. The vethrani had fought. They had fought with the rigid hierarchical discipline of a species that had been a military culture for 9,000 years. They had held 7 of the 11 outposts through the first bombardment. They had held 4 through the second. By the third, they had held 1, Kethos Prime. And they had held it only because the garrison commander, a scarred female named Reth-Vashan, had collapsed the northern ridge tunnels on top of 200 of her own wounded, rather than let the Caliph use those tunnels to flank the surviving defenders. The vethrani had sent a distress call to the Galactic Compact 12 hours before Osai's boots hit the ground. The Compact had acknowledged the transmission, logged it, and informed the vethrani that no member fleet was positioned to respond within the operational timeframe. The transcript, which Osai had read on the drop, was 2 pages long. It contained 4 references to jurisdictional constraints, 3 to resource allocation parameters, and 1 to the ongoing review of Sareth Reach territorial classification. It did not contain the word help. The Terran Union had picked up the distress call through a monitoring station on the edge of the Sareth Reach. Earth had no treaty with the vethrani, no trade agreement, no diplomatic history of any kind. The vethrani had rejected every overture of contact for the better part of a century. They didn't want allies. They didn't want trade partners. They wanted to be left alone. But someone in Terran Fleet Command had listened to the recording of Rethvashin's distress call, the flat, controlled voice of a commander, reporting the systematic destruction of her civilization's border defense, the loss of 10 garrisons in 36 hours, the failure of every alliance she had been told would hold, and had made a decision. The Terran Union sent a response force, not a fleet, not a battle group, a medical rapid reaction unit, Task Force Mercy. 47 combat medics, 16 trauma surgeons, 9 field nurses, a mobile surgical theater, 400 stretchers, 12 tons of multi-species medical supplies, and a single Vanguard-class gunship, the TSV Anselm, to get them to the surface and keep them alive while they worked. That was 6 hours ago. Osa had been on the ground for 5 of them. She heard Driscoll before she saw him, the heavy, even tread of a man carrying 60 kilograms of kit at a steady jog through rubble. Private First Class Elijah Driscoll appeared at the edge of the collapsed wall, drag stretcher folded under one arm, his face streaked with dust and something darker. He didn't say anything unnecessary. He unfolded the stretcher, positioned it beside the vethrani, and waited for Osai's count. On 3, watch the stumps, they're cauterized but fragile. 1, 2, 3. They lifted him. The vethrani hissed a sharp, involuntary sound, and his claws dug into the stretcher frame hard enough to score the composite. Driscoll didn't flinch. He secured the straps with the practiced speed of a man who had done this 400 times in training, and was now discovering that the training had been generous in its assumptions about how much a body could weigh. "He's heavy," Driscoll said. 70 kilos over human baseline. The scales are dense. Osa checked the IV line she'd rigged to the vethrani's arm, using the adapter kit that Dr. Patel had designed during the 18-hour transit. The vethrani circulatory system ran copper-based blood at a pressure that would burst a human vein. The adapter kit accounted for that. It accounted for a lot of things that nobody should have known about a species that had never let anyone close enough to study them. Patel had pulled data from every source in the Terran database: merchant encounters, sensor readings, a single academic paper written by a xenobiologist named Cowrie, who had spent 3 months on a vethrani trade station 8 years ago, and published her findings in a journal that had 14 subscribers. They moved the vethrani toward the triage point, and Osai felt the ground shake. Not an impact. Something heavier, more sustained, the vibration of heavy structures settling as their supports failed. The northern ridge was collapsing in slow motion, and everything they were doing was happening inside the window between one collapse and the next. "Osai," Captain Lena Ferris's voice came through the command channel, clipped and controlled. Ferris was the senior medical officer on the ground, running triage from a cleared section of what had been the vethrani garrison's vehicle bay. "We've got a situation in the Eastern Trench network. Vasquez's team found a sealed compartment, 43 vethrani, mostly wounded, some critical. The compartment is pressurized, but the structural supports are failing. We've got maybe 90 minutes before the ceiling comes down." "How many of ours can you send?" "I'm sending you, Vasquez, Driscoll, and Tanaka's fire team for security." "That's the best I can do. Morrow and Chen are running the surgical theater, and I've got every other medic triaging the main casualty collection point. We're at 319 patients and climbing." 319. The vethrani garrison had held 600 troops. The Caliph bombardment had killed 208. The tunnel collapse had buried another 40. The rest were scattered across the ruins of Kethos Prime, and Task Force Mercy was trying to find them all before the planet finished the job the Caliph had started. Copy, we're moving east. Os handed the vethrani soldier to a stretcher team at the triage point and turned toward the eastern ridge. Vasquez fell in beside her, his med kit reslung across his chest, the weight of it pulling his left shoulder down in a way that said he'd been carrying it for 5 hours without rest. Driscoll was behind them. Tanaka's fire team, 4 Marines with weapons hot, not because anyone expected a Caliph ground assault in the next hour, but because the Anselm sensor suite had detected 3 Caliph patrol corvettes in a holding pattern beyond the planet's second moon, and assumptions about timelines were a luxury they couldn't afford. They crossed the garrison compound in 8 minutes, moving through shattered corridors that still held the residual heat of orbital strikes. The vethrani architecture was angular, heavy, built from a dark composite their briefing called thermal stone, a mineral that absorbed and redistributed heat. In wartime, the thermal stone had absorbed the bombardment's energy and was now radiating it back at temperatures that made the air shimmer. Osai's suit thermals held, but she could feel the press of it through the insulated panels on her forearms. The eastern trench network was deep, narrow, reinforced with thermal stone slabs and metal bracing. The bombardment had collapsed the upper sections, but the lower levels carved into the bedrock had held. That was where Vasquez's forward scouts had found the sealed compartment. The entry point was a blast door that had been warped by heat into a shape that no longer matched its frame. It was sealed from the inside. Someone on the other side had locked it during the bombardment, trapping the occupants in a pressurized pocket while the world above them came apart. Osai, I've been talking to them through the door, Vasquez said. He was breathing hard, but his voice was steady. They've got a junior officer and they're running things. Name's Keth Sarath. 18 wounded, 9 critical, 16 ambulatory. Their medical supplies are gone, used up during the bombardment. They've been using field dressings made from uniform fabric. Air quality degrading. The ventilation system failed 2 hours ago. CO2 is climbing. The ambulatory ones are showing signs of hypoxia, slow responses, confusion. The critical ones are worse. Osai pressed her hand flat against the blast door. The metal was warm. On the other side, 43 people were dying by degrees in a box they'd locked themselves into to survive. Tanaka, can your team cut through this? Staff Sergeant Maya Tanaka assessed the door with the detached professionalism of someone who had breached harder targets. Plasma cutter will get through in 12 minutes, but the thermal load is going to spike the temperature inside. If they're already heat-stressed. They're reptilian. Their thermal tolerance runs 15 degrees above ours. They can take it. Then we cut. Tanaka's team set the plasma cutter at the door's weakest point, the warped upper hinge, and the blue-white arc began eating through thermal stone and composite. Os used the 12 minutes to prep. She laid out her supplies on a cleared section of trench floor, organizing by priority: airway kits, the copper blood IV adapters, hemostatic agents calibrated for vethrani coagulation chemistry, burn treatment packs, the portable oxygen concentrator that could be rigged to deliver a breathable atmosphere for their lung physiology. Halfway through the layout, her scanner pinged a second patient signal from somewhere deeper in the trench, faint, intermittent. She marked the bearing, filed it, and kept working, one crisis at a time. Vasquez worked beside her, silent, efficient. They had trained together for 3 years at the Fleet Medical Center on Luna. He was from Juarez, she was from Accra. They had never served in the same unit until Task Force Mercy, and they had known each other for exactly 22 days. In that time, Vasquez had proven himself to be the most unshakable medic I had ever worked with. He didn't talk when talk wasn't needed. He didn't hesitate when hesitation could cost a life. And he carried, in the breast pocket of his tactical vest, a photograph of his 2 daughters that he never took out and never mentioned, because mentioning them would mean thinking about them, and thinking about them would mean thinking about what he was risking, and Hector Vasquez did not have time for that math. The plasma cutter finished. Tanaka's team peeled the door back in sections, and the air that rushed out was thick, hot, and sour with carbon dioxide. Osai pulled her rebreather up and stepped through. The compartment was larger than she'd expected, a storage bay repurposed as a shelter, roughly 15 meters by 20, the ceiling low enough that she had to duck at the far end. The vethrani were arrayed in rows along the walls, the wounded on the floor, the ambulatory sitting upright with their backs against the thermal stone. The ambient light was a dull red emergency glow that made every scale look like dried blood. Keth was standing at the center of the compartment. Standing, despite what looked like a broken collarbone and burns that ran the length of his right arm. He was younger than Osai had expected from the voice Vasquez had described. His scales were a mottled green-gray, lighter than the senior soldiers, his crest still soft at the edges. He saw Os, and his eyes locked on her with an expression she had seen on the faces of every besieged soldier she had ever treated. The look of someone who had been holding the line alone and had just realized someone else was here to help carry it. He said something in vethrani. The translation module rendered it as, "You are the ones from the signal." "Terran Union Medical Corps," Osei said. "We're here to get your people out." Soreth's crest twitched. He looked past her at Vasquez, at Driscoll, at Tanaka's Marines. His amber eyes cataloged their equipment, the medical kits, the stretchers, the IV rigs, the oxygen concentrator. Not weapons. Not soldiers in the way his culture defined soldiers. Medics. Surgeons. People whose entire loadout was designed not to kill but to prevent killing from finishing its work. "We asked for soldiers," Soreth said. The translation was flat, but the tone carried something else. Not disappointment, bewilderment. "You got us instead," Osei said. "Let me see you're wounded." She moved through the compartment systematically, Vasquez on the opposite row, Driscoll running supplies between them. The critical cases were brutal. A female soldier with shrapnel wounds across her abdomen, the fragments still embedded in the dense muscle tissue beneath her ventral scales. A male with degree thermal burns over 70% of his body. His scales fused to the remnants of his armor in patches that would require surgical separation. An older male, a senior NCO, by the markings on his remaining armor, who had lost his left arm at the shoulder, and was holding a field dressing against the stump with his remaining hand. His amber eyes fixed on a point in the middle distance, with the 1,000-meter stare of a man who had moved past pain into a place where pain was just another fact about the universe. Osei worked the female soldier first. She pulled the shrapnel fragments one by one, using the magnetized extraction tool that Patel had modified for the density of vethrani metalwork. Each fragment came out trailing copper-bright blood that she stemmed with hemostatic gel calibrated to bond with their coagulant proteins. The soldier watched her the entire time, eyes half-lidded but alert, one clawed hand gripping the edge of the makeshift bedding. Halfway through, the soldier said something in a low, rasping voice. The module translated, "Why did you come?" Osei didn't look up from her work. "Because you called." "We called everyone. No one answered." "We answered." The soldier's grip on the bedding loosened 1 degree. Not much, but enough. Vasquez finished stabilizing 2 patients and moved to the burned male. The work was painstaking. Each fused section of scale and armor had to be separated with a thermal solvent that dissolved the bond without damaging the living tissue beneath. Vasquez worked with the focused, unhurried precision that was his gift, his hands steady even when the soldier beneath them shuddered and hissed at the solvent's sting. "Osei," Vasquez said quietly, not looking up. "His vitals are holding, but the burns on his dorsal ridge are down to the nerve cluster. If we don't get him to the surgical theater in the next 45 minutes, he loses motor function below the waist. Driscoll, get me a priority evac stretcher and tag him red. Tell Ferris we've got a theater case incoming." "Copy." Driscoll moved. Osai turned to the senior NCO with the missing arm. She knelt beside him and gently removed his hand from the stump. The field dressing beneath was soaked through, not with red blood, but with the thick, copper-green ichor of a vethrani who had been bleeding slowly for hours and had simply decided to outlast it. "How long have you been holding that?" The module translated her question. The NCO looked at her with eyes that had seen the destruction of every defensive line he had spent his career building, and said a single word. Since the bombardment, since the ceiling came down, since the world ended and this room became the only world left. Osai replaced the dressing with a proper hemostatic seal and started an IV. The NCO watched her hands, the strange, flat-nailed, scale-less human hands that moved with a sureness he could not reconcile with the fact that these people had never treated a vethrani patient before today. She adjusted the flow rate on the copper blood analog, checked his pressure with the palm scanner, and noted the reading. Low but stable. He would live. He would live because a xenobiologist named Cowrie had published a paper in a journal with 14 subscribers, and a surgeon named Patel had read it on a transport ship 18 hours ago and designed an adapter kit in real time. The ground shook again, harder this time. Dust sifted from the ceiling, and a crack opened in the thermal stone wall on the compartment's east side, running from floor to ceiling like a dark vein. Tanaka appeared at the entry. "Osai, we've got a problem. The Anselm sensors are reading structural failure in the sublevel above us. The ridge is shifting. This compartment's load-bearing walls are compromised." "How long?" "Engineering gives us 60 minutes, maybe less." 60 minutes, 43 patients, 18 wounded, 9 of them critical. The nearest stable ground was the triage point, 300 meters back through a trench network that was collapsing in sections. Osai did the math. She did it the way she always did it, not as an abstraction, but as bodies. 43 bodies. The ambulatory ones could walk with help. The 18 wounded who weren't critical could be moved on stretchers, 2 bearers per stretcher. The 9 critical cases needed careful transport, jostling, could kill the abdominal wound patient. The burned soldier couldn't be rotated. The NCO's stump seal would rupture under vibration. Vasquez were evacuating all of them now. All of them. All of them. Vasquez looked at the compartment, looked at the wounded, looked at the crack in the wall. He nodded once. They organized the evacuation in 4 minutes. Osai assigned the ambulatory vethrani to pairs, each pair supporting a walking wounded between them. She used hand signals and the translation module in equal measure, and she discovered something in those 4 minutes that no briefing had prepared her for. The vethrani understood evacuation doctrine. They were a military culture. They knew triage. They knew column movement. They knew how to carry a comrade. The ambulatory soldiers organized themselves with a speed and discipline that would have impressed any NCO on Earth. Sareth took charge of his people's end of the movement with a quiet authority that belied his age and his injuries. He positioned himself at the rear of the column, broken collarbone and all, and refused Osai's offer of a sling with a gesture that needed no translation. But he accepted a comm link. Os clipped a backup translation module to his collar, and for the first time, a vethrani officer and a Terran medic shared a tactical channel. "If anyone falls behind," Osai said, "you tell me. Don't let them sit down. Once they sit, getting them up again costs time we don't have." Sareth's amber eyes held hers. "I will not lose anyone in these tunnels, Sergeant. I have lost enough today." There it was, not the rigid warrior pride she had seen in the other vethrani. Something rower. The voice of a young officer who had been given command of 43 lives because everyone above him in the chain was dead, and who had held those lives together with bandages made from uniforms and sheer refusal to give up. "Neither will I," Osai said. "Let's move." They moved. The trench network was a nightmare in slow motion. Sections that had been passable 2 hours ago were now partially collapsed, thermal stone slabs tilted at angles that turned corridors into obstacle courses. Tanaka's Marines went first, clearing debris, bracing unstable sections with portable jacks, marking the path. Behind them, the ambulatory column moved with the grinding, determined pace of people who had decided that walking was what they were going to do, regardless of what their bodies thought about it. Osai stayed with the critical cases. She and Vasquez carried the abdominal wound patient between them, the stretcher level, their steps synchronized in a rhythm they had practiced 1,000 times in training corridors that had been clean and well lit, and not actively trying to fall on them. Driscoll had the burned soldier on a rigid spine board, moving with a care that turned every step into a negotiation with gravity. 2 of Tanaka's Marines carried the NCO, his IV bag swinging from a clip on one Marine's chest rig. 60 meters in, the first section collapsed behind them. It wasn't dramatic. No explosion, no roar. Just a sustained, grinding crunch as the ceiling of the section they had passed through 30 seconds ago gave way and filled the corridor with rubble. Dust rolled forward over them in a wave, coating everything in a fine gray powder that tasted of mineral and heat. Nobody stopped, nobody looked back. At the 80-meter mark, Tanaka's Point Marine flagged a junction. 2 corridors, both partially collapsed, one angling upward toward the surface and the other continuing on the level. The upper route was shorter by 50 meters, but the ceiling was cracked in 3 places and the thermal stone supports were bowed inward under load. The level route was longer, narrower, and intact. "Level route," Osai said. "I'm not running critical patients under a bowed ceiling." "Level route's going to cost us 12 minutes, Tanaka said. 12 minutes we spend. The alternative costs us patience." Tanaka didn't argue. She redirected the column. At the 150-meter mark, they hit a blockage. A thermal stone slab had shifted and was now wedged across the corridor at a 45-degree angle, leaving a gap at the bottom that was wide enough for a person to crawl through but not wide enough for a stretcher. Tanaka's team went to work with the plasma cutter, but the slab was dense. The tool was running low on charge, and the clock was running. Osai looked at the gap, looked at the burned soldier on the spine board, looked at Driscoll. "We go under." "Driscoll, we slide him through on the board. You push, I pull from the other side. The gap's not wide enough for the board. Then we turn him on his side. Left side only, the burns on the right are down to the dermis. Any pressure on the right and we lose the tissue." Driscoll's jaw tightened. "That's going to hurt him." "Yes, but it's going to keep him alive." They did it. Osai crawled through the gap first, turned and positioned herself on the far side. Driscoll rotated the soldier gently, precisely, the way you rotate a man whose skin is hanging on by biochemistry and stubbornness, and slid the board through. The soldier made a sound that was not a word in any language but was understood in all of them. Os caught the board, leveled it, and checked his vitals. Still holding. The burn margins hadn't torn. The nerve cluster was intact. "Next," she said. They passed all 9 critical patients through the gap, one at a time. The 4th patient, one of the walking wounded who had deteriorated during the march, a vethrani with a chest wound that had reopened under exertion, started hemorrhaging copper-green blood through the field dressing as Driscoll guided him through the gap. Osai caught him on the other side, pressed her palm flat against the wound site, and held pressure while Vasquez slid through with a fresh hemostatic pack. The vethrani's breathing was shallow, his scales around the wound darkening to near black as the tissue lost oxygenation. Osai held pressure for 90 seconds counting, silent, feeling the pulse of a circulatory system that ran at twice human pressure beneath her palm before the hemostatic agent bonded and the bleeding slowed to a seep. She tagged him critical. 10 critical cases now. The math kept changing and the math kept getting worse. It took 18 minutes to pass them all through. The ceiling groaned 3 times during the process. Each time, Everyone froze, looked up, and resumed when the groaning stopped. Nobody said what they were thinking. The thoughts were the same for everyone, human and vethrani alike, and saying them aloud would not have changed anything. Midway through, one of the ambulatory vethrani stumbled. The soldier, a young female, her left leg wrapped in improvised bandages that were soaked dark with copper green, went down hard against the corridor wall and didn't get up. Sareth's voice came through the comm link immediately. One down. Ambulatory column, third from rear. Osai was 80 meters ahead with the critical cases. She couldn't go back. Driscoll, swap me. Take the stretcher. I've got the fallen. Driscoll took the stretcher handles without breaking stride, and Osai doubled back through the column, moving against the flow of bodies in a corridor barely wide enough for two. She found the fallen soldier propped against the wall by two of her comrades, her breathing rapid and shallow, the bandage on her leg saturated. A secondary bleed, something that had been manageable at rest, had opened up under the exertion of the march. Osai dropped to one knee, pulled the bandage, and found the source. A deep laceration across the quadriceps analog, the muscle tissue separated enough to see the striated green fibers beneath. She packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, wrapped it tight enough to close the tissue gap, and hauled the soldier upright. You can walk on this. It's going to hurt, but the packing will hold. Lean on your squad mates. Don't stop. The soldier's amber eyes, young, frightened, exhausted, found Osai's face. She nodded once and started walking. Her comrades took her weight between them. The column resumed. At 250 meters, Vasquez's patient crashed. The abdominal wound soldier, the female with the shrapnel, went into cardiac arrest. Her copper-green blood pressure dropped to a reading that Osai's equipment registered as incompatible with life, and her respiratory rate went to 0. In a hospital with a full surgical suite and a species-matched crash team, the response time for a vethrani cardiac event was 11 seconds. In a collapsing trench on a bombarded planet, with a combat medic whose entire knowledge of vethrani cardiac physiology had been learned from a briefing packet on an 18-hour transport, the response time was whatever Vasquez could make it. He made it 7 seconds. He dropped to his knees beside the stretcher, ripped open the emergency cardiac kit, and found the electrode placement chart that Patel had drawn by hand during the transit. Vethrani hearts were dual-chambered, offset to the left of their thorax, encased in a protective cartilaginous sheath that made standard defibrillation useless. Patel's chart showed the 2 points on the ventral scales where the sheath was thinnest, points that no human had ever needed to find on a living patient before this day. Vasquez found them. He placed the electrodes. He charged the portable defibrillator to the setting that Patel had calculated based on Cowiery's paper, a setting that no machine had been manufactured with, that Vasquez had manually programmed during the drop. "Clear," he said. The shock hit. The soldier's body arched against the stretcher straps, her claws scoring the composite in 4 clean lines. The copper blood IV line swung and caught on Vasquez's arm. He ignored it. No pulse. Charging again, clear. The second shock. The soldier's body arched again, and this time there was a sound, a low, guttural rasp from deep in her chest, the sound of lungs trying to remember their job. Vasquez checked the monitor. The dual-chamber rhythm was there, irregular, weak but present, a heartbeat, not a good one, but a heartbeat. "Got her back," he said. His voice was flat, professional, the voice of a man who had just done something that no textbook said was possible and was already moving on to the next thing that needed doing. They moved. At 270 meters, Osai heard something that made her stop. A sound from behind a sealed hatch on the corridor's south side. Not a structural sound, not debris settling. A voice, faint, rhythmic, repeating the same phrase. She pressed her ear to the hatch. The translation module picked up the words through the metal. "Still here, still here, still here." Vasquez, hold the column. She checked the hatch mechanism. jammed. Tanaka's Marine, Corporal Rowe, hit it with a breaching charge on low yield and the hatch blew inward. Behind it was a space barely larger than a closet, a utility alcove filled with pipes and conduit. Wedged into the alcove, knees drawn up, one arm clearly broken, scales dulled to a pale gray-green that spoke of shock and dehydration, was a vethrani. Young, barely adult by their species standards. A medic, by the torn insignia on the shoulder of the shredded uniform. A vethrani medic. The young soldier looked up at Osai. The amber eyes were glassy, unfocused, the crest flat against the skull in what the briefing called a submission posture. The repeated phrase stopped. The soldier stared at Osai, at her human face, at the red cross on her tactical vest, and the translation module rendered one word. Medic. Yeah, Osai said, medic. She got the young vethrani out of the alcove, splinted the broken arm, ran a fluid line, and added another body to the column. 44 now. The column kept moving. They reached the triage point with 11 minutes to spare. Osai emerged from the trench into the vehicle bay that Ferris had turned into a field hospital, and for a moment the scale of what Task Force Mercy had built in 6 hours stopped her. The bay was organized with the ruthless efficiency of people who had turned crisis medicine into a craft. Triage lanes color-coded with tape on the floor. The mobile surgical theater set up in the bay's cleanest corner, its sterile field maintained by portable air processors that hummed like bees. Dr. Morrow elbow-deep in a vethrani thorax, working on something that no human surgeon had ever attempted. Dr. Chen running 3 IVs simultaneously on a patient whose biology she had learned from a briefing packet and a prayer. Nurses and medics moving between rows of wounded aliens, checking vitals with equipment that had been jury-rigged to read copper-based blood chemistry, changing dressings made from human-grade materials adapted on the fly. 364 patients. Human medical staff, 72. Ratio of 5 patients to every medic, and every medic running on stimulants, training, and the specific kind of stubbornness that made a person choose this job in the first place. Ferris found Osai at the scrub station. The captain's face was drawn, her eyes carrying the particular weight of a commander who was holding the math together by will alone. The Anselm's reporting movement on those corvettes, Ferris said. They've shifted orbit, possibly repositioning for a ground approach. Commander Holt is running defensive scenarios, but if they come in, our gunship is 1 ship against 3. How long until we can lift the critical cases? Morrow needs another 2 hours to finish the surgeries in progress. After that, we can start loading, but the Anselm can only carry 220 passengers on a medical configuration. We've got 364 patients plus our own people. So we make 2 trips. If the corvettes let us. Os looked across the vehicle bay, at the rows of vethrani soldiers being treated by human medics, at Vasquez, who was kneeling beside the female soldier he had shocked back to life, monitoring her cardiac rhythm with the focus of a man watching his own children sleep. At Driscoll, who was changing the dressings on the burned soldier with hands that had not shaken once in 6 hours. At the young vethrani medic from the alcove, who was sitting upright now, arms splinted, watching the human medical operation with an expression that had moved past bewilderment into something closer to awe. The young medic was watching a human nurse named Kowalski clean and dress a wound on a vethrani elder's neck. The elder was massive, 2 meters tall, his scales darkened with age to a near black, his crest scarred from battles older than Kowalski's grandparents. Kowalski was 23, 5'4", and she was handling the elder's neck wound with the same gentle competence she would have used on a child. The elder sat motionless, his eyes following her hands, and something in his rigid posture was softening 1 degree at a time. Osai understood what the young medic was seeing. These aliens were a warrior culture. They understood soldiers, combat, the calculus of force. What they did not understand, what they had no cultural framework for, was this. An entire unit of another species, deployed across a battlefield not to fight but to heal. People whose weapons were sutures and plasma bags and defibrillators jury-rigged from a paper in a journal with 14 subscribers. People who crawled through collapsing tunnels and carried strangers on their backs, not for glory or conquest, but because someone had called for help and they were the ones who heard it. The vethrani had asked for soldiers. They had prayed for legions to come thundering out of the void with weapons blazing. What they got was 72 people with medical kits and a single gunship, and those 72 people were pulling their civilization back from the edge, one patient at a time. Vashan arrived at the triage point 40 minutes later. The garrison commander came in on foot, refusing a stretcher despite burns that covered half her face and a left leg that was visibly fractured below the knee. She was flanked by 2 aides who looked worse than she did, and she walked through the vehicle bay with the controlled stride of a woman who would acknowledge her injuries on her own schedule and not before. She surveyed the field hospital in silence, the rows of her soldiers being treated, the human medics working, the surgical theater, the supply crates, the organized chaos of professionals doing what they had trained to do. She found Osai because Osai was the closest human with a red cross on her chest. "You command this." The translation was inflected with something that might have been respect, or might have been disbelief, or might have been both. "Captain Ferris commands the task force. I'm a sergeant, I do the work." Vashan studied her. The garrison commander's eyes deep amber, the pupils vertical slits in the light moved over Osai's face, her kit, her hands. The hands that had pulled Vashan's soldiers from rubble. The hands that had pushed a burned man through a gap in a collapsing tunnel. The hands that were, right now, stained with the copper-green blood of people Osai had never met before today. "We sent the signal to everyone," Vashan said. "The Compact, the Meridian Assembly, the Hegemony, the Vekaris Trade Federation. Everyone who had ever claimed the Sareth Reach was part of their sphere of interest." She paused. "Nobody came." "We came." "You are not soldiers." "No." "You have one ship." "Yes." Vashan's crest rose slowly, then lowered. In vethrani body language, Osai would learn later, this was the equivalent of a salute. "What do you need from me?" "Your people's cooperation during the evacuation. Your command authority to keep the ambulatory patients organized during the lift. And your permission to treat your injuries, Commander. Because you have a compound fracture and untreated burns, and I'm not going to watch you stand on that leg for one more minute." Vashan looked down at her own leg as though she had forgotten it was broken. The bone was visible through a gap in the burnt scales, white against green, sharp against soft. Any human would have been screaming. Vashan had walked 300 meters on it. "In 9,000 years of the vethrani Compact," Vashan said, "we have never accepted medical aid from another species. We have never needed to. We have never been offered it." She paused. The translation module rendered the next sentence with a cadence that suggested the words were formal, old, pulled from somewhere deep in the language. "I did not know this was a thing that existed in the universe." "It exists," Osai said. "Sit down." For the first time since Osai had been on Kethos Prime, a vethrani made a sound that the translation module flagged as laughter. It was low, rough, and it lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Vashan sat down on a supply crate, extended her fractured leg, and let Osai work. Os set the bone using a portable fixation kit, aligning the fragments by scanner and securing them with pins designed for human femurs but workable on vethrani bone density at a modified torque setting. Vashan did not make a sound during the entire procedure. She watched Osai's hands with the focus of a commander committing intelligence to memory. When Osai finished and began wrapping the burns on Vashan's face, the garrison commander spoke again. "The Compact told us no fleet was positioned to respond. They said the resources were allocated elsewhere. They said jurisdiction was under review. She turned her head slightly, letting Osai access the burn on her cheek. You are not a fleet. You are not even positioned. You came from outside our jurisdiction without authorization into a war zone you have no treaty obligation to enter. Another pause. You brought bandages. And surgeons and a gunship. One gunship. One was enough to get us here. Vashan's amber eyes held Osai's for a long beat. Something in the garrison commander's face behind the burns, behind the rigid discipline of 9,000 years of warrior culture, behind the pride of a species that had never asked for anything and never expected to receive it, was changing. Not breaking. Changing. One was enough, Vashan repeated. She said it quietly, as though testing the idea against everything she had been taught. The evacuation began 90 minutes later. The Anselm descended through the fire-scarred atmosphere of Kethos Prime with Commander Holt at the helm, the gunship's defensive systems running hot, its sensors tracking the 3 Caliph corvettes that were now openly maneuvering toward low orbit. Holt was not a medic. Holt was a warship officer with 20 years of combat experience and a ship that was designed to operate alone behind enemy lines. The Anselm had a crew of 40, a point defense grid that could intercept incoming fire from 3 vectors simultaneously, and exactly enough offensive armament to make the corvettes think twice. Not enough to win, enough to make them think. The first lift took 218 patients, the critical cases, the post-surgical cases, and the most severely wounded. Loading them took 41 minutes, and during those 41 minutes, the corvettes moved. The Anselm's tactical officer reported the shift over the open channel. The 3 Caliph ships had broken their holding pattern and were descending toward low orbit, spreading into a triangular formation that any warship officer would recognize as a targeting envelope. Holt responded by powering up the Anselm's point defense grid and broadcasting a single transmission on the universal emergency frequency. Medical vessel conducting casualty evacuation. Any interference will be logged and forwarded to the Galactic Compact Tribunal Registry. It was not a threat, it was not a warning, it was paperwork, and somehow the paperwork held. The corvettes adjusted course, pulled back to medium orbit, and resumed tracking. Holt loaded the last stretcher, sealed the ramp, and lit the engines. Morrow and Chen went up with the patients, continuing treatment in the Anselm's medical bay, which had been stripped of everything non-essential to make room for stretchers. The surgical theater went up too, folded and secured in the cargo bay. The Anselm climbed out of the atmosphere, punched through the Caliph sensor net, and drove for the rally point beyond the Sareth reach. Osai watched the ship go from the ground, standing in the ruins of the vehicle bay with Ferris, Vasquez, Driscoll, and 38 other medics who were staying behind with 145 patients and no ship. The corvettes did not fire on the Anselm. They tracked it. They painted it with targeting sensors that the Anselm's warning system screamed about for the entire climb, but they did not fire. Whether the Caliph didn't want to provoke a Terran response, or whether they had scanned the cargo hold and seen the rows of wounded, and decided that shooting a medical transport was a line they wouldn't cross, Osai never learned. It didn't change the work. The wait for the second lift was 4 hours. 4 hours on the ground with no ship, no defensive capability beyond the portable shield generators that Tanaka's Marines set up in a perimeter, and 146 patients who needed constant care. 4 hours of changing dressings and monitoring vitals and adjusting IV rates and talking to patients who couldn't understand her words but who understood her presence, her hands, the fact that she had not left. In the first hour, a vethrani soldier on the far side of the vehicle bay went into respiratory failure. His lungs already compromised by smoke inhalation during the bombardment ceased. The nurses called for Osai, and she crossed the bay at a run, pulling her portable ventilation kit from her pack as she moved. The soldier was massive, easily the largest vethrani she had treated, his chest rising in short, hitching spasms, as his respiratory muscles fought against tissue that had swollen shut. She couldn't intubate. The vethrani airway was shaped differently from a human's, the tracheal opening protected by a cartilaginous flap that deflected standard equipment. She improvised. She used a flexible catheter intended for fluid drainage, threaded it past the flap by feel, because no textbook existed for this procedure, because she was writing the textbook in real time on the floor of a ruined vehicle bay, and connected it to the portable oxygen concentrator. The soldier's chest rose, fell, rose again. The hitching stopped. The rhythm steadied. She stayed with him for 11 minutes, monitoring each breath, adjusting the oxygen mix for a hemoglobin analog that bonded differently with oxygen than human blood did. When his vitals stabilized, she tagged the procedure in her field notes: the catheter angle, the flap technique, the oxygen mix ratio. Every patient she treated on Kethos Prime was a first. Every procedure was an invention. And every invention, if she wrote it down, became a tool that the next medic could use on the next vethrani who couldn't breathe. When his vitals held steady, she moved to the next crisis. A vethrani patient on the far wall had pulled out his own IV line, whether from confusion or from the ingrained instinct of a soldier who did not trust anything he hadn't seen before, and was bleeding from the insertion point. Osai reseated the line, recalibrated the drip, and placed her hand on the soldier's forearm until his crest, which had risen in agitation, slowly lowered. The touch worked. It always worked. Across species, across biology, the touch of a steady hand still meant the same thing. Vasquez sat beside the cardiac arrest soldier for the remainder of the wait. The soldier's dual-chambered heart was holding a rhythm now, not strong, but steady. Vasquez had rigged a continuous monitoring line that fed data to his wrist display, and he watched it the way a father watches a sick child's breathing. At one point, the soldier opened her eyes, focused on Vasquez, and moved her clawed hand to rest on top of his. Vasquez looked at the hand, looked at the soldier. He didn't move his hand, he didn't say anything, he just stayed. In the third hour of the wait, the young vethrani medic from the alcove found Osai. The arm was splinted, the fluids were working, and the soldier had regained enough color in the scales to look less like a corpse and more like someone who had simply had the worst day of a very young life. The medic stood in front of Osai and through the translation module asked a question. "Your unit designation, what is it?" "Task Force Mercy, Terran Union Medical Corps." "Medical, that is the word, not combat, not assault, medical." "Yes." The young medic looked down at Osai's kit, at the sutures, the IV bags, the hemostatic gel, the defibrillator that had brought a dead soldier back to life. Then the medic looked at Osai's tactical vest. No rifle, no sidearm. The only thing clipped to her vest beside medical equipment was the translation module and a canteen. "You crossed a war zone, you crossed contested space, you came through orbital bombardment, you have no weapons. We have a gunship. One gunship. Against 3 corvettes and a conquered system. One gunship was what we had, so one gunship is what we brought." The medic's crest shifted, rose, and held the vethrani posture of recognition, which Osai would learn was reserved for moments when a soldier acknowledged something that exceeded the framework of normal understanding. It was not a salute. It was not submission. It was the body's way of saying, "I see what you are, and I did not know this existed." "On my world," the medic said, "there is no word for what you do. We have words for fighting, for killing, for dying, for winning. We have no word for crossing a war zone to put another species' blood back inside them." Osai thought about that. Then she said the only thing that seemed honest. "We don't have a word for it either. We just call it the job." The Anselm returned. It came in fast, Holt driving the gunship through the atmosphere at an angle that was technically outside the hull's rated tolerances, and practically inside the envelope of what a Vanguard class could survive if the pilot didn't blink. The corvettes moved to intercept, and Holt did something that the after-action reports would describe as aggressive defensive maneuvering, and that Osai, watching from the ground, would describe as a pilot telling 3 warships to get out of the way by flying directly at them and daring them to shoot. They didn't shoot. The Anselm landed, the ramp came down. The second evacuation took 26 minutes, 26 minutes of stretchers loaded, ambulatory patients guided up the ramp, equipment stowed, and the final sweep of the ground to make sure nobody was left behind. Vasquez carried the cardiac arrest soldier up the ramp himself. He would not let anyone else take her stretcher. The soldier's clawed hand was still resting on his wrist, and he walked up the ramp with the careful, unhurried stride of someone carrying something he had earned the right to hold. Driscoll made the last sweep. He moved through the vehicle bay, checking every corner, every shadow, every collapsed section of wall. He found one more, a vethrani soldier who had crawled out of a utility shaft during the wait, too weak to call out, lying in the dust behind a toppled supply rack with one arm reaching toward the sound of human voices. Driscoll picked the soldier up, slung the weight across his shoulders, and walked up the ramp without breaking stride. Nobody was left behind. Osai was the last human on the ground. She stood at the base of the ramp, scanning the ruins of Ketho's Prime one final time. The garrison was rubble. The ridges were collapsing. The sky was still stained with the chemical signature of orbital bombardment. Somewhere under that rubble were the vethrani soldiers who hadn't made it, the 208 who had died in the strikes, the 40 who had been buried in the tunnel collapse. They would not be coming home. But 364 would. 364 soldiers of a species that had never asked for help from anyone, who had fought alone because alone was all they had ever known, who had called out to a galaxy that had filed their scream under non-priority, and been answered by 72 people with medical kits and a single gunship. Osai walked up the ramp, the hatch closed, the Anselm lifted. In the medical bay, the vethrani lay in rows, secured on stretchers and cots, their copper-green blood running through IV lines adapted from a paper nobody had read. Human medics moved between them, checking vitals, adjusting treatments, doing the work. Vasquez was beside his cardiac patient. The female soldier's heart was steady now, the dual-chambered rhythm holding strong on the monitor. Vasquez had been on his feet for 14 hours. His hands, when Osai looked at them, were shaking, not from fear, from exhaustion, from the simple physical cost of holding the line for that long without stopping. "She's going to make it," Vasquez said. "They're all going to make it." He looked at her. "Not all of them, Nara. Driscoll lost the elder from the eastern trench. The burns were too deep. He coded 30 minutes before the second lift, and we couldn't bring him back." Osai closed her eyes, opened them, nodded. "Not all of them. 364 recovered. One lost during the wait. The elder whose neck wound Kowalski had cleaned, who had sat motionless, while a 23-year-old human nurse treated him with the gentleness of someone caring for family, had died quietly, surrounded by people from another world who had never met him and had come anyway. Driscoll was sitting in the corner of the medical bay, his back against the bulkhead, his eyes open, his face empty. The face of a medic who had done everything right and lost the patient anyway. Osai sat down beside him. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that Driscoll didn't already know. You showed up, you did the work, and sometimes the math didn't care. She sat with him, and they flew through the dark together. The Anselm cleared the Soreth Reach without incident. The Caliph corvettes tracked them to the boundary and broke off. Whatever calculation the Caliph commanders had made about the cost of firing on a medical ship, about the political fallout, about the simple, stubborn fact of a single gunship flying at them head-on, it held. At the rally point, the Terran hospital ship TSV Nightingale was waiting. 200 beds, 4 surgical theaters, a full xenobiological staff that had been assembled in 14 hours, and was still reading the briefing materials when the Anselm docked. The vethrani were transferred, all 363 of them. Vethrani was the last to leave the Anselm. The garrison commander walked down the transfer corridor under her own power, her fracture now set, her burns dressed, her crest held at the level that Osai now recognized as full military composure. At the end of the corridor, Vashan stopped. She turned. Osai was standing at the Anselm's hatch, watching the transfer complete. Vashan looked at her across the length of the corridor. The garrison commander, who had collapsed tunnels on her own, wounded to save the rest, who had walked on a broken leg through the ruins of her command, who had fought a war and lost, and called for help from a galaxy that didn't come, looked at the human sergeant with the copper-green stains on her gloves and the red cross on her chest. Vashan's crest lowered, fully all the way down. In vethrani culture, a fully lowered crest was the highest form of acknowledgement one soldier could give another. It was not given to superiors. It was not given to conquerors. It was given to someone who had earned a place in the story of your survival, someone without whom the story would have ended differently. Osai lowered her head, not a salute, not a bow, just a nod. The kind of nod one professional gives another when the job is done and the words haven't been invented yet. Vashan turned and walked into the Nightingale. Osai stood at the hatch for a long time after that. She stood there while Vasquez came up behind her and put his hand on her shoulder. She stood there while Driscoll walked past, his eyes still carrying the weight of the one they hadn't saved. She stood there while the hatch finally closed and the Anselm began its long transit back to Terran space. In the after-action report, Task Force Mercy's deployment to Kethos Prime would be recorded as a non-treaty humanitarian intervention, conducted without authorization from Galactic Compact Command, in a contested zone outside Terran jurisdiction. The report would note the successful evacuation of 363 vethrani military personnel, the loss of one patient during the ground operation, and the adaptation of human medical protocols to an unstudied alien physiology under combat conditions. The report would not note that Hector Vasquez kept the photograph of his daughters in his pocket for the entire deployment and never looked at it once. It would not note that Elijah Driscoll sat in the corner of a medical bay and stared at his hands for 2 hours after losing a patient he had fought to save for 6. It would not note that a young vethrani medic had looked at a human combat medic and discovered that there existed, in the universe, a species that would cross a war zone unarmed to put a stranger's blood back inside them. It would not note what Vashan whispered, in vethrani, just before she walked into the Nightingale. The translation module did not log it. The corridor's audio pickups were offline. No human heard the words. But when the vethrani opened formal diplomatic channels with the Terran Union 6 months later, the first document they submitted was not a trade proposal or a defense pact. It was a single page, handwritten in the old vethrani script, bearing Vashan's seal. It read, to the ones who came when no one would, "We asked for warriors. You sent something better." The document was filed in the Terran Diplomatic Archive under Letters of Gratitude. It was the first entry in what would become, over the following decade, the longest section in the archive. But that was later. That was politics and history and the slow machinery of civilizations learning to see each other. On the Anselm, flying home through the dark, Nara Os sat in the medical bay and cleaned her instruments. Vasquez was asleep in the chair beside the cardiac patient, his hand still resting where the soldier had placed hers. Driscoll was writing something in his field journal, not a report, just words, the kind of words a person writes when the day has been too heavy to carry without setting some of it down on paper. Osai finished cleaning the last instrument, placed it in the kit, and closed the case. She looked at the rows of vethrani soldiers, sleeping now, their copper-green blood steady in the IV lines, their wounds dressed with human hands, their lives held together by sutures and adapters, and the stubborn refusal of 72 people to let the math be the final answer. 1 gunship, 72 medics, 363 soldiers brought home. The job,